Hi, welcome everybody, and thank you for being allowed to be here today. It's quite cool that even though the circumstances are different, that we get to connect even more with our stakeholders and our members, of course. Ralph, would you do next slide, please? Oh, there we go. So the picture could be better, but it is me. Before presenting, I guess it's only polite to kind of introduce myself, and the others will do the same. My name is, as Ralph said, Jakob. I work primarily with standards development, but also try to assist in other aspects in GWO. My background is from the Armed Forces, and I also have an engineering degree, which I admittedly haven't used a lot. I worked with training in the Air Force, radar training, and then moved on to wind power, and I haven't looked back since, and been with Siemens Gamesa and Emitter Vestas in various training roles. So my mail is in the bottom. I'm quite sure it will pop up at the end as well. Please reach out for anything if you need me. Good. Next slide, please. Søren, would you put a few words on yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Søren Götze, and I am the operations manager here at Global Wind Organization. I have been with the Secretariat since 2015, and I am involved in pretty much everything that pertains to our governance, to operations, and for winter development. And of course, as Jakob also said, if there's any questions on the back of this, you're also all more than welcome to send me an email. My mail is listed at the bottom of the slide right now. So yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Cool. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Alex Booker, project manager with the GWO. Been here for a little over a year now. Previous to that, spent 14 plus years within the wind industry, working for Vestas primarily as a service technician, moving through installation, commissioning, and then ending up in the training school in Vestas here in Denmark. Previous to that, I had a background in aviation as an engineer, and I've worked in many different fields, including fishing, actually. So back to you, Jakob.
Brilliant. So as you can see from the agenda, we're kind of going to go from framework to the real deal, the training itself, and then of course spend some time on questions. We might go a bit fast today because we got an hour, but it is with the ambition to actually have as much as possible time for questions at the end. Next slide, please. Good. Before we go into the digital requirements and training standards, I'm just going to spend very short time on how we normally do things, and also kind of highlight that this is an interesting situation we're in, where we're looking at how to mitigate the skills fade due to the COVID-19 situation. So normally we release twice a year, in October and then on the 1st of April, but that's not the case right now. I mean, as you can see from the date, of course, we're close, but we have these release dates because we normally follow a very stringent review release pattern. A new training standard, once it's been developed, we release it. It's out there for a year. We do the initial review of it, and then it's put into a 2-year cycle. So for those of you who know the extent of the GWO portfolio, you could probably appreciate the amount of training standards that we review every single year, even though it is in a 2-year cycle. This, however, is different. I normally just touch upon it, just for new people who have an idea how things work. Next slide, please. Good. This is kind of the foundation of what we believe in when it comes to training in GWO. A lot of academics and researchers have put effort into this. This model in particular is not let's call it the end of all, the answer to everything, but it shows quite good when we look at learning retention rate. So and this is, I guess, a bit ironic, if you look at the audiovisual and the lecture of me speaking right now. So in 2 months' time, you remember 20–30% of this, which is also why Ralph is going to put it on the website so you can go and look at it again. And we have various other means of communicating. But in short, there are two kind of methods. There's the passive one, which we're doing right now, and then the participatory. That's a hard word. And we want to be in the practice by doing discussion group and demonstration area, and that's what we aim for with all of our training standards. Good. Next slide, please. Now, for the foundation part, the framework, I'm going to spend a few minutes on the digital training requirement, and at the end of that, there'll be an FAQ. Søren will also help me on one of the slides here from a governance standpoint, but first I'll kind of go through why we did it, etc. Next slide. So a while ago, Alex and we actually sat down and made a draft for the digital requirement. And the reason we did that was there was an ongoing project to look at the training provider criteria and the criteria for certification bodies. The digital requirement was scheduled for the October release, but due to COVID, it was moved ahead and accelerated. And for now, it has been released a week ago as an addendum to the criteria for training providers and for certification bodies. From the 22nd onward, it will be moved and embedded into what is now no longer the criteria, but the requirements, versions 7 and 9, for training providers and certification bodies. So it's here. It's not something that is intermediate, but it's going to be moved from its current shape of the addendum to the criteria in the very near future. Next slide, please. The project team is a bit different because we are in different times. I tried in my own way to kind of visualize this by saying, well, we had a group of team, which is Alex and I, internal in GWO, helped by the rest of the team, of course. We created a draft for this, which we then got validated with the requirement working group that was already in place for the update of the training provider criteria and the certification body criteria. So it is an internally developed product, but it has been aligned and validated by a working group with members from both. And I guess you can see this on the logos. There are training providers, there are operators, etc., and also auditors. So we got Lloyd's, DMVGL, etc. So I'm quite happy about that. Good. For the key elements, this document, as I mentioned earlier, has parts that kind of goes to the criteria for certification bodies. That is covered in the prelude or the first page of it. And then the remaining part is connected to the training provider criteria. We start with, on the training area, a definition of digital learning. It's not something we created ourselves. So we went and researched quite a bit and found a definition that is commonly used. So we state that digital learning is the use of computer and internet technologies to deliver learning. It sounds quite broad, and well, it is, and it should be, because as most of you probably know better than me, the scope of digital learning is incredibly large. What we also did to kind of, let's call it, embrace that was when we listed the digital learning technologies. We took all the, let's say, the common ones, so interactive e-lessons, online presentations made by an instructor, or virtual classrooms, virtual and augmented reality, blended learning, which is very common today, I guess. But we also have the last one in 112F, other technologies that support or enable delivery of training via digital means. For us, it's incredibly important to kind of say it's actually not the technology, even though it's very fascinating. I for one, I love augmented reality. It really gets out the inner training geek in me. But we're not as much concerned with the generation or the name or the company that developed a technology as to what it can do. So we just kind of, if it supports or enables the delivery of training digitally, good. Then it fits in this kind of box we created here. Looking at it, there are two key things we deal with, there's a lot of stuff in these, but I'm sure that you guys read it, it's on the website. But if you look at the two key areas for us, at least, is, well, knowledge, the learning domain of knowledge. We believe that you can achieve that in a digital realm by all of these solely. But as soon as you move into skill and attitude, well, there are some things that are relevant to focus on there. And some say, well, skills can only be taught using virtual and augmented reality. We believe that we don't know that yet, and we can probably use other technologies. So we say, well, you need to look at the fact that it needs to mimic a real work situation. There are safety aspects. You need to have a technology that can cover body motor functions when learning, spatial understanding, tactile elements. And those are really key when dealing with this. There are many other very interesting things in this, and we'll get back to some in the FAQ. A key one is, if you do blended learning, we want to make sure that when you start, and let's call it a digital app or whatever to get knowledge for a training, well, from you start that until you get your practical exercises, if it's a blended one, the limit is 4 weeks due to learning retention. So that's a key one to at least kind of notice when going out and creating these training standards and governing them, so to speak. Another thing is, during virtual classrooms or anything, the training provider needs to advise and guide best possible the delegate to be safe when doing this from his or her room or where it may be. Good. Annex. We love annexes. Can we go one back, please? I'll cover this really fast. There are guidelines in this for the different technologies. Have a look at them. They're pretty cool. They're meant to help. Next slide, please. Søren, would you like to now share all of the stuff that I said? How are we going to govern that?
Yes, that would be my pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so talking about governance about this new BSTR-P standard and all this digital learning is really interesting. So the BSTR-P is a training standard on equal footing with the other standards in the GWO portfolio. And this also means that the training standard will need to be audited by an approved certification body that has documented conformity with our requirements. And you can always find a full list of approved certification bodies on globalinsafety.org. The fact that the BSTR-P is a standard the same as our other standards means that the governance framework is also the same. So in order to be certified to deliver this standard, training providers will need to be audited with the BSTR-P as an extension to the current certificate, which is no different than wanting to be certified to deliver any other training module to your existing portfolio. What is new here is that we open up for the option to conduct a remote audit by using online tools. So we do not make suggestions to we do make suggestions to tools that could be used, but we do not make an explicit list of requirements in that regard. We expect that certification bodies who wish to conduct an online audit comply with the IAF-MD 4 2018 on remote audits. In addition to the digital learning requirements we have just released, we will also have, as was mentioned earlier, a new set of requirements coming out for training providers and certification bodies next week, pending approval of the Audit and Compliance Committee and the Executive Committee. And these documents will also incorporate digital learning and remote audits. For digital learning, when assessing the training in the domain of knowledge, this can be done using digital tools like the ones we've mentioned in the document, or something that is similar but achieves the same goal of being able to assess the learning objective being achieved. However, when assessing the training in the domains of skills and attitude, this requires practical demonstration in a scenario that is similar to a real work situation. And the delegate must therefore be able to also demonstrate spatial understanding and body motor functions. And this is an area that needs extra attention when we also talk about digital learning. Just like with any other standard, the delegate performance assessment form or a similar form must also be used to properly assess if the course participant has reached the learning objective. As part of training with digital learning, the training provider must also have developed a policy about how to use it, how it limits or enhances the opportunities for learning. If there are any limitations, how are these mitigated? or how can the training provider further enhance the learning experience with these new opportunities? And as always, when we're talking about a GWO standard that a training provider has been certified to deliver, the criteria for training providers, which will now be the requirements for training providers, and the standard itself must be complied with at all times. The system that the training provider utilizes must also comply with any data privacy requirement. And if it uses recordings of the participants, these must be informed prior to starting training that they are being recorded. Any system that is used for digital learning must also incorporate a very high level of realism with a wind turbine environment to be able to enable the delegate to use the knowledge and skills in a real work situation. That means that you will have to think about how you incorporate a wind turbine-like environment into a digital training solution. Additionally, training providers will also have to verify the identity of the course participant if the course participant is at a different location than the instructor. If the training is split up into a theoretical and a practical part, where the course participant must demonstrate the practical part at a later date, this must then be done within 4 weeks, and the training provider must verify that the person showing up to the practical training is actually the same person that attended the online training. So this is very quickly about the governance portion about digital learning and about the BSTR-P standard. So I'll give it back to you, Jakob.
Excellent. So if we can do next slide, please. I'll just really fast go through the FAQ, which is, I guess, just a warm-up for the questions to come later. But these are some of the questions we had already and some of the ones we expect to get. So, and I'll just read them out loud. Are the digital training requirements temporary? No, they're here to stay. It's a persistent requirement, which is really important to mention, I believe. We touch upon what other technologies mean. I said, well, whatever can support learning. Technology will move faster than requirements. So we need to have focus on just kind of embracing new technology. Can a training standard be fully delivered digitally? Well, if the training provider make sure that all the digital requirements are adhered to and the learning objectives are met, including all practical exercises in a safe manner, of course, and they are approved to do so by an auditor following the normal setup, yes. I'm excited for this. Let's see what happens, yes. I touched on the blended learning, so we're not going to spend more time on that. If we see GWO releasing training standards designed purely for digital delivery, well, as Alex is going to talk about in a few, the BSTR-P is one of those, but we have no more planned as it is today. The review of the requirements, this is a new area. So we're actually reviewing continuously right now. And in October, we'll do a full review as well. And then I'll go into the normal review cycle. Ralph mentioned initially that there will be more webinars, etc., and we will be open for support in this area. So please stay tuned for that. Next slide, please. Are you ready and good to go, Alex?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Jakob, and thank you, Søren. Okay, so I'm going to talk through the new BSTR partial online training standard. I'll try not to bore you. I'll give you as much detail as I can, and then, of course, we will open up to questions afterwards. So, next slide, please, Ralph. Yes. So first and foremost, of course, need to thank the people who have put in time and effort to actually review the work and the analysis of the training and, of course, review the new training standard. As always, GWO relies on the input from our members and from our training providers to actually help us develop new training standards. And without that input, we would not be able to do what we do. So a big thank you to those guys. So next slide, please, Ralph. So coronavirus happened and it affected pretty much everybody globally to some extent. And one of the things that it did towards the wind industry is actually close down training centers temporarily, meaning that technicians out there weren't able to access training, meaning that their skills would start to fade. And that was actually a serious problem. That presented quite a serious safety risk to the industry, either through people losing their skills, or it also represented a potential financial cost where technicians couldn't actually go to work, therefore leaving wind turbines shut down, presenting a really serious challenge to the industry. So the motivation here was actually born out of looking at ways of dealing with skill fade and knowledge fade in the industry. And the way this kind of came about is we were tasked to look at how do we actually present that. And we came up with a number of different ideas, like virtual classrooms, which is how this standard evolved. But we looked at other methods, like through safety briefings, toolbox talks, and various other things. And through the analysis of the refresher training for the basic safety, we actually came to a conclusion where we could actually deliver quite a lot of the training standard virtually and through an online sort of classroom environment. That analysis and the sort of looking into our training standards was actually reviewed then by the working group that I showed you in the previous slide. So we've stuck as close as we can, albeit much faster than normal, to our standard development process. So next slide, please, Ralph. One back. Thank you. So the BSTR-P, and the P is partial. I am really not that imaginative with names of things, so apologize for that. It is designed for the virtual classroom environment. That was what was in the mind of the team as we actually developed this. And there's a couple of things that is really good about that, is that it can actually be delivered completely using existing tools like Microsoft Teams, WebEx, Skype, those kind of platforms that a lot of people already use. So the idea was to create something that didn't require massive amounts of new software and that could actually be rolled out relatively quickly from that point of view. So it is with that in mind. The elements that are in that training standard can also be delivered through other digital methods, provided you stick to the new requirements for digital learning. So even though it's aimed at the virtual environment, the virtual classroom, it can actually, some of it can actually be done in through, say, e-learning or through other online delivery. So next slide, please, Ralph. So in analyzing the existing BSTR modules, we found that actually through the virtual classroom, we could actually cover quite a lot of the modules. So in fact, we've actually covered 73% of the objectives and elements of those BSTR modules, if we count all 5 modules, including sea survival. That does leave some outstanding skills evolutions that need to be addressed, which we are currently looking at. How do we actually address those? So that is work that is ongoing, but it gives the times on the screen give a fairly good indication of what is the required time input for those outstanding skills. And you can also see on there that through that analysis, we've managed to actually reduce the complexity of the modules to some extent, through things like repeated learning objectives, repeated elements, things of that nature. So we've actually managed to take out 26% of repetition, things like that. I will talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So next slide, please, Ralph. The target audience. This training is actually aimed at all wind personnel who have existing BSTR or BST records. So it means that those technicians can take this virtual online course that will then allow them to have an extended validity, essentially, on their existing training records. So it is aimed at everybody who already has a training record. So next slide, please, Ralph. The durations in the standard are as shown on the screen. So between 2 and 4 hours overall for each module, giving a total of 17 hours and 15 minutes. That 17 hours and 15 minutes, it does include, of course, the introduction and evaluation part of each module. So if you are, for example, going to deliver modules packaged and bundled together, then of course you do not need to repeat the introduction and the evaluation section. If I think one of the questions that came in previously into info at GWO was actually about combining the modules. And yes, of course, you can combine the modules, just as long as you cover all of the elements and the learning objectives of each module. So if you want to do some manual handling parts within the first aid and within the working at heights, that is absolutely fine, as long as you are covering and documenting that you can cover all of the learning objectives and the elements. So next slide, please, Ralph. The validity period, I touched on it briefly. So what's actually stated in the training standard is that it will extend the validity of their BST and BSTR by 6 months. How that works is that when the course participants actually complete this training successfully, of course, then they will receive a new window record, and that window record will be valid from the expiry date of their existing certificate, and it will be valid then for 6 months from that date. Next slide, please, Ralph. So we're going to dive a little bit into some of the details in the training standard. So the focus areas here are safety first, attitude, and mindset. Of course, within the virtual classroom environment, it is difficult to cover all of the practical exercises in a safe way. There are some, so we have some skills like, for example, pre-use inspections of equipment, the rigging of rescue devices, manual handling techniques, things of that nature. Those are all aimed at technicians being on the ground, not at height, doing any of these remote exercises. There are also instructor skill demonstrations of some of the other skills to actually remind the participants of those skills, to actually jog their memories about what they have already learned in their training. And then, of course, there's a lot of knowledge refreshment in that as well. And through the analysis, sort of post-analysis of the training standard, what we've actually found is that we've increased the safety attitude objectives by 20% in this BSTR-P compared to the full BSTR standard. So next slide, please, Ralph. So a couple of other things. While we've been going through this, of course, delivering in the virtual world and in the virtual classroom is quite different for many instructors. So we've tried to simplify the training standard in some other areas as well to allow them to focus on actually delivery. And one of those was to look at the taxonomy section and simplify it. So we've done that. We've actually taken away the old table and the description, and we've actually replaced it with some easier to read tables with fewer action verbs. So we've gone from over 100 possible action verbs down to around 7. And then we've also included some examples of expected behavior. So what should the instructor do at a explain action verb, and what should the participant actually do in response to that? And then, of course, in line with what we've done with ART, we've highlighted in the learning objectives the action verbs are all in bold text, and we've put the indicators after each of the learning objectives to give you an idea of the level and the domain. Next slide, please. So again, because virtual classroom is different to the traditional classroom layout and delivery, we've actually included a new section, section 8, which is all about delivery and assessment in a virtual class environment. And in there, we've kind of included a bit about operationalizing the standard, so about the layout or the new sort of layout of the learning objectives and the elements, and the equipment requirements, and how do we assess those learning objectives and the things that the instructor needs to focus on. It is overall a couple of pages, and I would recommend actually reading through it, as it does give some quite useful information, some tips and tricks about how to actually deliver these this standard in the virtual world. So next slide, please, Ralph. So I talked about complexity reduction. So on the screen, you can see a comparison actually between the BSTR version 10 and then the new BSTR-P. So one of the things we've done is in the header, we've actually included the module name in the header for that particular module. So wherever you are in the training standard, you will know that you are within module fire awareness or first aid or working at heights. So it's easier to sort of comprehend actually on, oh, this is lesson 3 of fire awareness rather than, oh, lesson 3, or which module am I in? So that's easier to read. The learning objectives have been made more specific with the aim that they are then easier to understand and easier to apply. The action verbs highlighted in bold text, and of course the taxonomy level and domain indicators. And those learning objectives, where possible, we've taken out repetitions, and where we had sort of learning objectives that were extremely close together and there might have been just one word difference between two, we've combined them so that it's much more concise and much easier to actually deliver. The other thing is within the lesson elements, thank you, Ralph, the learning objectives are now not repeated in the elements, and the elements themselves are predominantly aimed at the instructor and what he needs to do to actually deliver that lesson and to meet those learning objectives. The element numbering and the element names have actually been aligned as far as possible with the learning objectives. So throughout most of the standards, not everywhere, but mostly, if there is 4 learning objectives, there will be 4 lesson elements. And those lesson elements are related then, of course, to each learning objective. We haven't included the learning objectives into the elements. So previously you saw the instructor shall do something and then the course participant shall do something. And mostly those repetitions of the course participant actions were actually a repetition just of the learning objectives. So it seemed a waste to have those repeated. So from the instructor point of view, delivering this training standard, when you are measuring the course participants and you're looking at the assessment of their abilities, they need to be able to do what it states in the learning objectives. Other things then, within the elements themselves, they have been merged where possible. So where we had a lot of minor variations, you might have had 3 different elements with just 1 word changes in each. They've just been merged. The elements themselves, the wording has been made more specific to give a better indication of what we expect, and hopefully then it's easier then to deliver. And as Jakob pointed out earlier, virtual training and online lecturing is actually a really bad way of teaching, because the learning retention rate is really low. So what I'm doing now to you guys is actually really bad, because you will not remember most of this after a couple of weeks. So a lot of the instructor actions are actually based around discussions and leading discussions with the participants, and thereby discussion groups and everything gives a sort of more or less 70% learning retention rate. So the focus here is about giving the course participants the chance to discuss those things. And we have to bear in mind that this training standard is a refresher. So they already have been through the initial training. So they already have the knowledge. This is about refreshing that knowledge. Next slide, please, Ralph. Then finally, of course, the equipment list. And this has also been changed because there is an instructor section and a participant section. Now, you may be wondering, why on earth would we have participants requiring equipment within a virtual classroom? Shouldn't they be able to just jump online and do this? Well, actually no, because some of the skills that we cover, the participants actually need to do those skills. So they need to have hands on that equipment. So things like pre-use inspection of a harness, they need to actually get their hands on that and actually try it. Pre-use inspections of harnesses is something that is a little bit challenging within the industry because it's something that technicians forget to do. So it's a really important skill that fades actually quite quickly. So really important that they actually get reminded of the importance of that and the attitude and the mindset. Other things then that they need to do would be things like using work restraint lanyards to provide full prevention. And again, those things are covered with the intention that the participant is at ground level. And he actually demonstrates that skill at ground level so the instructor can see that he actually can do those things. Good. Then finally, we'll move on to the FAQ. So next slide, Ralph, please. So some of this I've already covered actually. I will go through them though, just as a recap. Is BSTR-P permanent? Well, for now, it's actually an interim measure, and it was designed to address skills fade within the industry. So it is for now interim, but it will be reviewed later this year. And we will have a look at it and see how does it work and take a decision on that later on. The remaining skills elements, how are we going to address those? And that is something that we are currently investigating because we actually need to do that. We need to address those skills elements. But what we want to avoid is that participants actually take the BSTR-P and then have to do the full refresher. That would be double up on training. So we need to look at how do we address that. And that is currently under investigation. Well, I spoke about the elements through digital methods. Yes, of course you can, as long as you stick to the requirements for that, then yes. Is it possible to combine the delivery of the modular elements? Yes, of course, as long as you cover all of the elements and objectives of each module that you are combining. To get certified as an existing training provider, then you just, as Søren spoke about, can get an extension to your current certificate, and then that can be audited online. The participants need some equipment because they do need to actually do some hands-on skills throughout the training. And then finally, the taxonomy section, the update to that, yes, that will be updated through the normal review cycle of the other training standards.